The self is the ordering and unifying center of the total psyche, that is, both conscious and unconscious, while the ego is the center of our conscious personality. For more information about the ego and the psyche, check out my videos on these topics, link given in the description. Now, according to Carl Jung, in the first half of our life, there is ego-self separation, which is followed by the ego-self reunion in the second half of our life. This process of alteration between ego-self union and ego-self separation seems to occur repeatedly throughout the life of the individual, both in childhood and in maturity. Now, the ego-self axis is the vital connecting link between the ego and the self that ensures the integrity of the ego. To understand this concept more clearly, let's look at these figures. Here, figure 1 corresponds to what Erich Neumann calls the original Ouroboros state. Nothing exists but the self mandala. The ego germ is present only as a potentiality. Ego and self are one, which means that there is no ego. This is the total state of primary ego self-identity. Figure 2 shows an emerging ego which is beginning to separate from the self, but which still has its center and greater area in primary identity with the self. Figure 3 presents a more advanced stage of development. However, a residual ego self-identity still remains. The ego self-axis, which is completely unconscious in the first two diagrams, has now become partly conscious. And lastly, Figure 4 is an ideal theoretical limit which probably does not exist in actuality. It represents a total separation of ego and self, and a complete consciousness of the ego self-axis. These diagrams illustrate the thesis that psychological development is characterized by two processes occurring simultaneously, namely progressive ego self-separation and also increasing emergence of the ego self-axis into consciousness. Now, when one looks back on his psychological origin, it has twofold implication. First, it is seen as a condition of paradise, wholeness, a state of being at one with nature and the gods, and infinitely desirable. But secondly, by our conscious human standards, it is an inflated state, a condition of irresponsibility, unregenerated lust, arrogance, and crude desirousness. Since the self is the center and totality of being, the ego, totally identified with the self, experiences itself as a deity. This is what is called a state of inflation. The term inflation is used to describe the attitude and the state which accompanies the identification of the ego with the self. It is a state in which something small, that is, the ego, has arrogantly identified itself with the qualities of something large, that is, the self. However, no matter the state of the ego, it is always drawn to the self. This ego-self affinity is illustrated mythologically by the Old Testament doctrine that man, that is ego, was created in God's, that is, the self's image. The self is initially experienced in projection to the parents. Although the self has an a priori existence, it however cannot emerge without a concrete parent-child relationship. Neumann has drawn attention to this and calls it the personal evocation of the archetype. He suggests that the self may be experienced in childhood in relation to the parents, initially the mother. Neumann calls the original mother-child relationship the primary relationship and says, in the primary relationship, the mother, as the directing, protecting, and nourishing source, represents the unconscious, and in the first phase, also the self, and the dependent child represents the childish ego and consciousness. The process of the development of consciousness seems to follow the cyclic course as represented in the diagram. Psychic growth involves a series of inflated or heroic acts. These provoke rejection and are followed by alienation, repentance, restitution, and renewed inflation. This cyclic process repeats itself again and again in the early phases of psychological development, each cycle producing an increment of consciousness. Thus, gradually consciousness is built up.